A member on my server drew my attention to this video and article on mask wearing and pagan ritual. Oh. Wait. It's talking about those masks? What? And why are they going on about initiation? Well, as I'm a pagan, let's see how they handle this. Oh, good gods. Aight, let's do this. Before we get started, I want to give a quick shout out to Jake4D for grabbing the book Magic, Science, and Reason off my wishlist for me. It means a lot to me and will help me a great deal on the video that I'm working on regarding ancient Greek medical practices. If you'd like to help out and get a shout out, links are in the description to the channel wishlist. Remember, it's never a demand and I'm glad to have you here. The video that I'm responding to today irritates me in a number of ways. It's from TruthStream Media, which is an odd name for a channel that primarily peddles conspiracy theories, but what are you gonna do? As I'm a pagan that engages in worship ritual on a daily basis, has participated in native world-walking rituals, occult rituals back in my past days before becoming a Hellenist, and secular rituals designed to help improve my daily life, I figured I might have something to say about it. And boy was I right. They speak so slowly in places that I might speed up or just read from their script, though I am going to have to play the video in places because just reading the script doesn't really give you an idea of the implications they're making here. There's a lot more unsaid than said, meaning that any criticism leveled at them about their message can be easily dodged. In other words, it's definitely a piece of propaganda, and I'll be looking at it as such. If you would like a refresher on the method I'll be using to analyze it here, there's a link in the iCard above to my video on the Harper's Letter where I go into detail about the 10 Commandments of propaganda. There's also a link in the description to the original video. Please watch it for context before going through this one, as in order to stay fair use, I can't play the whole thing here. With that out of the way, let's dig into the video.
Numbers of people who have had their lives disrupted, losing their jobs, losing their income, even losing. It certainly is unprecedented in the impact that it's had around the world. Thanks for joining us. I know we're surrounded by uncertainty. It feels like everything is changing.
One of my first red flags is the quote from Joseph Campbell here, who has been widely criticized by scholars for trying to cram all of mythology into this hero's journey model of storytelling, especially folklorists like Alan Dundes and Barre Toelken. Toelken criticizes him on the grounds that he tends to exclude things that don't fit his structure in his book Dynamics of Folklore, and Dundes on the grounds that the archetype theory he presents is antiquated and doesn't fit into many of the folk stories that Campbell excluded. When you pair that quote with the sound bites here, the implication is that the reality one is being shown, namely about the current pandemic, does not necessarily match reality overall. You're being lied to, and this video is going to show you how. We get a quote from Huxley next, and then a definition with several parts, so let's break that down a bit. They claim that ritual is 1. A psychodrama of consciousness, 2. Deliberate action taken to facilitate change, 3. Changes the whole environment that people exist in, and 4. Starts with the minds of the people themselves. As a pagan, I can agree with parts of this, but not the whole. For example, the first part of that definition is confusing. A psychodrama is a form of psychotherapy where patients act out events from their pasts, or a play or novel where psychological elements are the main interest. Given the concept of pagan rituals I've experienced, this doesn't quite fit. Also, how is it of consciousness here? Consciousness of what? The only folks I've seen who use psychodrama in that way tend to be modern occultists and atheopagans who really enjoy the psychological aspect to ritual. Most folks outside of the spaces don't see it that way. Also, not all ritual is meant to facilitate change in one's life or environment. Some rituals can be in thanks or celebration, and many modern pagans perform them solo. When I give offerings to the underworld gods on Ganesia, I'm not expecting some sort of favor, I'm thanking them for something they have already done. Namely, allowing me to give offerings to my ancestors for one night. This isn't meant to facilitate a change in any sense that would be recognizable in the following parts of that definition. Group rituals can be said to shift the way that one sees the world after, but I don't think that's the entire purpose of ritual. Ritual can be to connect with the gods or other people, and if one already believes in those gods and is thus engaging in ritual for that reason, it likely isn't going to change the way you see the world that radically. We'll get more into this later, but I really dislike how they frame ritual in such an otherworldly and creepy way throughout. Ritual doesn't need to be a massive event that shakes the entire world every time you do it. It can be a quiet moment set aside for time with the gods. But let's get back into it.
Artist Sharon Devlin once bluntly described the true purpose of ritual as being a method to alter one's mind. It's a sacred drama in which you are the audience as well as the participant, and the purpose of it is to activate parts of the mind that are not activated by everyday activity, she said. The mechanics of change through mechanism, a rhythm to sync to, merge and flow with, a magnetic draw drawing one down the path toward transmutation. Rituals are vehicles driving home those ideas, the information, the data, the symbols, which, upon transmission, create the language by which new society members communicate after they are initiated.
So this is interesting, because they're conflating cultic initiatory rites with all of ritual, which is more than a bit disingenuous. They talk about a, quote, new society, when even in modern times we have rituals we ascribe to that make meaning in our adult lives. In white, middle-class families, one of the big ones is the acquisition of a car for a teenager and the process of learning how to drive it. Note, I'm not necessarily saying that people of color don't do this also, it's just more likely that somebody of that particular type, in my country at least, is going to be able to afford to do this. I, for one, didn't actually have this particular initiatory rite because my family was too poor. Getting one's first job and earning income for the first time, purchasing a home or getting your first apartment, high school graduation, quinceañera, your 21st birthday, and the bar hop or party with friends where you take your first legal drink, these don't feel like rituals because they're part of our everyday society, yet they mark major milestones in our lives after which we see things differently, and society also treats us differently as well. Adults who own houses garner more respect than those who don't. Teens after they've gotten their first job are treated as more responsible, etc. By this incredibly broad definition, any major milestone in any society can be treated as an initiatory ritual. It's also interesting that they put this in the frame of pagan rituals, as you see from the images in the background of Shinto and Mexican shrines to the dead. Christians have these rituals as well, in the form of baptism and church attendance, marriage, and funerary rites. These are religious rituals that fit all of those criteria, yet in this society, they don't carry the ominous weight that they're trying to imply here. The next section gets into the idea that a new worldview is imparted after the ritual, and that not everyone is a conscious participant in ritual actions. Again, not even most ritual fits this criteria, but I'm assuming that they're moving into talking specifically about initiatory rites, so let's steelman them a little bit here. The idea of new ways of thinking and behaving coming after an initiation ritual is accurate, but the idea that people are not conscious participants is strange to me. In the examples that I listed before, it's understood by the people learning how to drive the car or purchase a home that this is a major change, after which certain aspects of their lives will be radically different. Likewise with baptism, marriage rites, and funerary rites. This is the purpose of these things, and consent is actively given. One of the few sections I find actually tends to come from Christianity, and it's the tendency to baptize babies and children found in some sects like Catholicism or the dead in Mormonism. That's weird to me, but it can also cause damage in the case of the former, as people forced into things that they were never desired may not realize that there's a way out. That might look like a point in the favor of the video's argument, but most of the imagery here is meant to evoke a discomfort in Christian viewers with the pagan other, rather than drawing any attention to their own weirdness.
An initiation ritual typically involves 3 stages. See if any of this sounds familiar to you.
Because this is why we transform it.
First, isolation for purification. The initiate is separated from the mundane. Did you know mundane means of the world? The initiate is largely removed from the otherwise familiar persons, places, and things one is used to, in order to be cleared of them.
Stay home, protect yourself, protect our system. Stay home. That's what we have to stay home because if we don't, stay home, stay safe.
This is where they start to, quote, say a lot more, both in the imagery and the text itself. The first stage of a ritual is purification, they tell us, and that purification removes from the self things that are familiar. The problem here is that this isn't the case for every kind of initiatory ritual, not even religious ones. When I did my ritual dedicating myself to my gods, I used carnips to purify myself, but I did these things in my own home, in front of my altar, and went straight back to normal life. There wasn't any sort of detachment from normal ways of being and doing, and though time has gone on, I've thought slightly differently about things like blessings, I still accept science the same as I always have. When one learns to drive a car, there's no purification involved, there's simply the process. Baptism, which is another ritual, is itself a form of purification. Though one may behave differently after, baptism can happen in the home as well as a church, and doesn't normally require any sort of fasting or separation from normal life, unless one paints that meaning in the broadest terms. The most disingenuous part here, though, is the newsreels they play as they talk about this. With all this creepy, grainy footage meant to evoke the feeling of horror movies, rotting decrepit places, and secret cults, they play distorted bits of footage, cut in a way that one might only hear the urgent message to stay home. They leave out the context of because 3 to 5% of the people who catch this horrendous virus die, and just play the bits that fit their message. Remember the laws of propaganda propaganda I referred to earlier, this is covered by the first law, control the flow of information, where they present only the bits of the news that appear to support their point and make the watcher go, huh, without actually stopping to think about what's being said. The second commandment, reflect the beliefs and values of the audience, is in lockstep behind it, as most people who would be watching a video like this already have some preconceptions about the current pandemic and the conspiratorial ideas about its inception. The next bit talks about the separation and purification being an essential part of the control of the initiate, and how everything the initiate is exposed to, if related, will be controlled. The creepy imagery used here again invokes the idea of a horror movie, where creepy, shady underworld figures are stalking the viewer's every waking moment. But we discussed many initiatory rituals, which this isn't the case, even religious ones, so it would be most accurate to say some initiatory rites are like this, but even that doesn't support the point being made about mask wearing and COVID that's so heavily implied by the newsreels. The next segment, where it's heavily implied by the speaker that all initiatory rituals are overseen by a quote, high priest and or priestess, which doesn't make sense for the majority of what one could consider societal initiation rituals, especially given how prevalent self-initiation is for pagans in the modern day.
Thought.
Every generation has a higher purpose. Ours is to stay home.
With nowhere else to go except where allowed, the insulated, isolated initiate may be forced to confront his or her own reflection, and inner shadows that have been ignored or buried somewhere deep beneath the average day-to-day suddenly become unavoidable. Triggers detonated. Another purge. Just as they involve surrender, initiation rituals may also involve sacrifice. Both the tangible that can be held in a hand and the intangible, such as behaviors, may be given up by requirement. After all, for something to be given, something must also be taken. A token of submission, an ounce of blood, a pound of clay to be remolded.
The language here is so carefully chosen, it almost makes me angry, because they're trying to conflate all of initiatory rites, societal, religious, and otherwise, with cultic transformation ceremonies that are meant to control the thought patterns of the initiates. Triggers are detonated, another purge, facing the inner shadows that have been buried. They frame all of these ideas as unwilling tools of control through their imagery and the feelings that are meant to be invoked by it, and tie the idea of that unwilling control to the simple act of protecting other human beings from a deadly disease. And then, to top it all off, they attack the very idea of reciprocity and cadis, the idea of give and take, and assume that it all must be a massive problem that one would be willing to give to the gods or other people some small part of the self for the greater whole. They tie the idea of reciprocity, give and take, to submission, and then to the idea of molding clay, which for many of their viewers is seen with incredibly negative connotations. This gets reinforced in the next section. Quote, whether dramatically overt or deceitfully subtle, the ritual reinterprets reality, a new definition of reality is given. They talk about training and repetition, all while the imagery ties these ideas to cults and creepy horror movies, to an unwilling participation in an evil thing. Repetition is typical as it helps hammer home the spell on initiates. This incredibly Christian view that reciprocity isn't possible and that offerings must automatically be lost because nothing is returned, that willing belief and participation must be somehow coerced, again doesn't line up even with initiatory rites that we see in the majority of society. This framing is meant to deliberately make you feel as though you are being deceived, that protecting others means you're polluting your very soul and participating in something you never signed up for.
The wearing of masks may be required. Masking has traditionally played an important role in rituals of this kind.
Meantime, New York City has joined Los Angeles advising residents to cover their faces. Well, we've already seen a big jump in the number of people wearing masks. Well, they've announced that anybody who is flying on the plane is going to be having to wear a mask. See right behind me, about half the folks in line at this parking out there right now are wearing masks. Today there was a mandate that went into effect across the entire country to wear a mask.
Enabling and hastening the suppression of ego to help facilitate a death of the old identity before the identification with and manifestation of a new one. Disguised under a mask and hidden away, the initiate is more easily able to transcend the self, pushed further toward that invisible line between the physical and spiritual realms.
The fear that we have, the anxiety that we have, that's not just going
The disingenuous comparisons really ramp up here. They talk about mask wearing as being important to initiation rituals, but which ones? How common is that really? They're shacking themselves up to quite the colonialist narrative here with the images they display of African and South American ritual masks as the camera pans, while the news plays talking about people actively choosing to wear them without any context as to why. Oh, you're trying to make sure you don't accidentally infect other people as an asymptomatic carrier? Well, you're actually a dirty primitive pagan who's just worshipping the devil because you're wearing a medical mask. Ugh. Statements about the suppression of the ego are also pretty far off from the truth. In many of the rites that I've learned about, those wearing masks are actually meant to represent various entities, particularly in Native American rites, and embody those beings in that moment. It's not usually the initiate wearing these masks in these rites, but members of the community that then dance these roles. There's nothing evil or malicious about it, nor is it a form of trickery. To imply that this is the case while using this imagery is disrespectful to these still living cultures and pushes the viewer into a racist headspace where they conflate these things even more deeply with the other. In the next section, we get a pan over of Mexican shrines to the dead, along with other images that have been repeated throughout the piece. They tell us that trauma and the fear of death are key to the initiation rite, which again isn't necessarily the case, as I've given numerous examples of before, and that often roleplay of dying is key to the initiate that they might be reborn. They then state that the ritual is likely to be executed confusingly so that the initiate can't make sense of anything, so that they might be more susceptible to Pavlovian conditioning. All with bits of footage playing about the skyrocketing death rates of the virus and the worldwide fear of dying. But you know what they also don't do? They don't mention the name of the disease or that it's a disease at all. They're doing precisely the thing with this footage that they're claiming someone is doing to the reader. The identity of that someone is never made clear. Is it the government, the media, some shady agency, scientists, doctors, some group that rules over all of them? Who are the high priests and priestesses of this ritual cult they're claiming the masks are a part of? What part of our identities are we being meant to shed? These questions are meant to simply linger in your mind, but the problem is the video assumes you already have an answer. Shortly, we get the most direct comparison to the virus itself, but I'd like my audience to think about these questions for a moment before we continue. The implication that every doctor, media professional, government employee, manager, and hospital worker are all in on some gargantuan initiation rite run by a cabal of pagan priests is absolutely nuts. How many thousands of people would have to be in on this and keep it secret in order to pull something like this off? Let's take a look. By the way, thank you to my friend Fire for help with this portion. They dug up a lot of these statistics for me. Currently, according to a census done in 2016, there are 953,695 active licensed physicians in the US. That's almost 1 million people you'd have to deceive alone, let alone the journalists, of which there were 32,900 full-time journalists at nearly 1,400 daily newspapers in the US just the year before. Assuming you only needed 3/4 to achieve your aim, you're looking at 739,946 people if you're just looking at the doctors and journalists. Don't even get me started on adding government officials, nurses, specialists, and other journalists outside of newspapers. If you've ever tried to run a group project of any kind, or keep a birthday party or something secret from a friend, you know how hard it is at even keeping 10 to 20 people quiet, let alone 750,000. When you think about it for more than a moment, it falls apart completely. That's why they don't outright say it. These questions are meant to be implied, but the viewer is never actually given the time to consider the answer, all while the imagery and the quotes presented confuse them and stop them from holding any real logical thought as the video continues. It's like when your conspiratorial uncle asks you why the virus is so good at killing people if it just evolved naturally. There's an answer to that question, one that has to do with the ACE2 receptor and the particular spike proteins on the virus, but he doesn't expect you to answer it. The idea is to create the question and let it sit, to make you more susceptible to answers you'll be fed at a later date. After the metaphor of a virus breaking the body down and the initiation breaking down the self more than the virus, which subtly tells the viewer that wearing a mask will somehow change them more than the potential near-death experience of being intubated and hospitalized with no real guarantee of survival or the weight of potentially infecting a loved one and watching them die, we get this bit of psychological manipulation.
This is the second phase, the transition.
It's liminal time or liminal space. The word liminal literally means threshold, that we're on a threshold of a new time, a new way of doing things in our society, that there's going to be some transformation.
As the old self symbolically dies and passes away, the initiate descends into a state of liminality, a sort of fever dream purgatory nowhere land, the void in the middle. Thus the old self dies as the initiate is purified. Now a white room, a blank canvas washed and primed and desperate for paint, a tabula rasa. At the same time his old existence and way of life dies, the initiate transcending it is gradually being processed, reprogrammed, and incorporated into his or her new environment.
Because this is going to be transformative. It is going to be transformative on a personal basis, on a social basis, on a systems basis. We're never going to be the same again.
We again have a bunch of images meant to invoke horror and fear, along with native drumming and rattles meant to disorient and dislodge the viewer from any comfort they might have found in the preceding quiet. You've been made into a tabula rasa, a blank slate to be reshaped into a new being. by wearing a mask and going into social isolation to try to save people from a virus that could kill you and everyone you love. The implications being drawn here are so subtle and never outright said, but they're screaming in every quote they cherry-picked, every bit of footage they've portrayed. There's a new world being born and transformation, but what? What horrible things await us? Well, let's take a look. We most likely won't be shaking hands as much, that's for sure. People now understand the value of working from home, and we're seeing the edges of capitalist society crack at the failings of a private insurance system. We're also seeing the results of collective selfishness and collective unity, how some countries contained the virus and others, like the US, have dead numbering in the literal hundreds of thousands. We've already lost teachers, elders, experts, grandmothers, cousins, parents, friends. This transformation is happening because of the virus itself, and the mask is actually meant to stop the boulder of loss careening down the narrow cave we've built ourselves into. If anything, the disease exposed the flaws inherent in our society rather than the measures we've taken to respond to it somehow transforming us. And if you try to call the spontaneous evolution of a horrendous disease an initiation rite put on by a high priestess, you've got to contend with the stats that I talked about earlier. At the end, they talk about the final phase and the threat of it, and ask the open-ended question,
Does any of this sound familiar now?
Well, yeah, it sounds like the language of propaganda, wrapping itself in layers to create the illusion of answers to questions that were created by the narrative of the piece. It holds power because change is terrifying, but that change is not brought on by the policies used to fight the disease, but by the sheer weight of death we're already carrying on our collective shoulders from it. The implication that masks themselves, or even as we get to the end, somehow the virus itself was engineered to create this, ignores many of the problems I've pointed out with secrecy and how so few things in the world fit the narrative the video's creating. They're leading the viewer down into their own sort of initiation into fear. Fear of an unknown other engineering their lives, primed now to accept explanations given by other videos on this and other channels purporting to have the answers. The secret knowledge this eponymous they is denying the viewer. The rest of the commandments of propaganda find their way here. Commandment 4, use group pressure to horizontally shape beliefs and behavior, is found by the channel itself rather than anything specific in the video. Do you want to be one of the sheep or one of those in the know? 5 is found through the video format, cognitively penetrate and stick. This is achieved by the creepy imagery that I keep referencing. 6, distance the propaganda from its source, is found in the ambiguous nature of the channel. Who runs it? We don't know. There's no list of names and credits at the end, just the video. 7, accommodate the informational needs and habits, is found in the video format this is in and how short it is. Who doesn't have 10 minutes? 8, address psychological, social, and spiritual needs. The need to know is stimulated, the need to be special is touched upon, and the need to belong is denied. 9, personalize and dehumanize as appropriate, shows up throughout the appropriation of pagan symbols while dehumanizing these practices with creepy imagery and ideas dissociating them from their intended meanings. Much like the Harper's letter, this presents a problem with no solutions and leaves the viewer primed to accept whatever is later fed. Questions without answers, an incomplete narrative suggested without any recourse on how to act on it, and a mental state of fear will make the viewer easier to mold. By their own definition, who exactly is doing the initiation here? Anyway, thank you so much for sticking through that. This video annoys the hell out of me for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that the virus has come through my house. Needless to say, hubby and I ended up in the hospital with separate symptoms, him for a fever over 103 we couldn't get down for over a week, and me because of fizzing pain that concentrated in my leg for so long. We were worried I had clots. Please wear a freaking mask, even though it sucks. You might save the life of someone you love, or even someone you've never met. If you're new here and you enjoyed what you heard, separate yourself from the normal by disorienting the subscribe button and filling your senses with the notification bell. Drop down into the comments and chant out what you've learned, or just tell me it's all a Chinese hoax if you didn't actually watch the video. Special thanks to GaelicNox for the channel art, link in the description as always to their website and Twitter, and special thanks to my patrons. A few new books arrived over the last couple days that I'll be poring over for more Hellenist content, and I couldn't do it without you. The special Patreon bonus video was released on Saturday. It'll be available this Saturday on the main channel. If you'd like a shot at the drawing for the topic next month, the $10 and up video tiers get their shot every month. And remember, faith ain't fear.